My views on the subject of reincarnation have changed radically over the last several years, as more and more information has come to my attention which I just could not, in all honesty, ignore. Any science, including the study of God, that is, theology, works by making observations, coming up with a hypothesis about those observations, and then testing that hypothesis against observed reality one way or the other. If that hypothesis doesn't fit all the parameters of what is observed in reality, if it cannot explain everything which is observed, then a new hypothesis must be formed, and the process started over again. For many years, my views on this subject were shaped, like so many other Christians, around the interpretation of one verse in Hebrews 9:27. Excuse me. Which literally reads, "And according to as much as it is laid up for human beings to die once, yet with this judgment." And with this verse, supposedly, any possibility of reincarnation is impossible, because, biblically, human beings can only die once. I will address this further on. Sorry. Over the last several years, and due to different inputs from different sources, I've been seriously challenged to reconsider my views on the subject of reincarnation. These sources and inputs come from several different areas, including the Bible itself. Where the Bible is concerned, it is a bit more nuanced in some places. Virtually every Bible scholar is aware of the potential precedent of John the Baptist as a reincarnated Elijah, and that it was Jesus Christ himself who said it in Matthew 11:14. But there is also Jesus' question to the disciples in Matthew 16:13-16, where he asked them who people say that he is. Their first response is that the people thought he was either John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Let me ask you this. The question has to be asked. If they didn't understand reincarnation as a possibility, why would they have thought this? Why would that be the first thing out of their mouth? There is also the case of the man born blind in John 9:2, where the disciples ask, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Think about that question. How could the man have sinned before he was born if reincarnation was not a part of their worldview or understanding? Why would they have even asked these questions? And here's something else that might blow your mind if you're not accepting of reincarnation, is Jesus didn't correct them. When they asked him this, he just said, "Neither this man sinned nor his parents that he was born blind." He didn't go into a long explanation of, well, no, that's not possible, reincarnation is impossible, etc., etc. No, he just said, neither one. The truth is that a form of reincarnation was a common part of Hellenistic understanding of the afterlife, as written about by Plato in his dialogues surrounding the death of his teacher Socrates. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, in opposition to this understanding of the possibility of reincarnation, there is the verse in Hebrews 9:27 which reads, "And according to as much as it is laid up for human beings to die once, yet with this judgment." A careful examination of the original wording and an understanding of the possibilities of meaning involved, however, reveal that this verse does not actually negate the possibility that the judgment in question might be for a soul or consciousness to be reincarnated as a different human being. That is, in all reincarnational schemes, because a soul never inhabits the same body twice and never has the same experiences twice. Thus, it is never the same human being twice. While it might be the same soul or consciousness, it would still be a different biology as well as a different history, and thus a different human being. Some time ago, I was reading Before by Jim B. Tucker, MD. This work essentially summarizes for the layman what has been 65 years of research by Dr. Ian Stevenson and his team from the University of Virginia, of which Dr. Tucker became a part in the mid-90s, on reports of past life memories by children. Most of the research, conducted meticulously, was done by Dr. Stevenson, who between 1957 and 2006 documented 2,500 accounts of children between the ages of 2 and 5 giving details about a past life which they couldn't possibly have known. Where possible, Dr. Stevenson located the previous deceased person and identified them from the information the children provided. Of all of these, they all gave information about people who had died within 100 years of their birth. Some of them were relatives, some were not. Many carried birthmarks or physical deformities which matched wounds the deceased had upon death. If I understand correctly, those they were able to give the clearest identifying details were of the same language and culture as the deceased. There was one I had read about that, while not giving many details of a past life, was able to pick up and use Russian quickly, as though it was their native tongue, even though it wasn't. And that actually isn't hyperbole. This person, when they started studying Russian, all of a sudden not only picked up the grammar and vocabulary like that, but they started using idioms they were never taught, which were normal Russian idioms. The researchers are facts-oriented, looking for other normal explanations, and are painstaking in doing everything they can to keep their subjects free from bias or contamination by outside influences. In spite of their no-nonsense approach, the cases they describe are nothing short of impossible, if reincarnation of some kind has not occurred. They also made it a point to not approach this work from any kind of a religious bias of their own, the author himself having originally come from a Southern Baptist background, which denomination clearly repudiates and forbids a belief in reincarnation of any kind, as do most Christian denominations. For most people, conscious memory tends to start around 3 or 4 years old, and is coincident with the acquisition of one's first language. It is my thought that the brain depends on symbols in order to process sensory information and be able to describe it. These symbols are provided through verbal and written language. Prior to the development of language, all appears to be emotion and feelings. Given this, it would then follow that if a past incarnation had spoken a different mother tongue and been from a different culture altogether, it would have processed and understood that information with a different set of symbols altogether. Language is a moving target in terms of translation, especially with abstract concepts. So while a child or even adult who is raised in a similar language and environment to the previous incarnation might be able to remember some sensory and symbolic details about that past life, the person who is raised in a linguistic and cultural environment foreign to the past life will be able to recall none of it consciously, except perhaps for feelings and emotions they cannot place. This is similar to a person trying to remember events from prior to their development of language. It is more often than not that they will be affected by some conscious memories and emotions, maybe flashes of image which they can't place or explain, but nothing which makes any sense to them and which they can articulate. Of the many thousands of well-documented cases of children remembering past lives, there is one which, while not necessarily being unique, does stand out as a textbook example. This is even more so because the past life in question was identified after a good deal of traveling and research by both the parents and the psychologist who investigated the case. This is the case of a boy named James. James had terrible nightmares of crashing a plane into the ocean from the time he was 2 years old. His playtime also involved crashing toy airplanes into the floor or coffee table. When he could talk, he told his parents that he had been a pilot who flew planes from a boat called the Natoma, and he had a best friend named Jack Larson. He also called himself, for some inexplicable reason, the third James. With the help of the psychologist and his resources at the University of Virginia, they were able to discover that the USS Natoma Bay had been an aircraft carrier in the Pacific during World War II. From there, they were able to establish that Jack Larson had been a pilot, very much still alive, and whom they were able to meet on that carrier. For Mr. Larson, they discovered that James Houston had been his best friend, who had crashed into the ocean during a battle not far from Iwo Jima. I could be wrong on the location, but I'm pretty sure it was Iwo Jima. The boy was having nightmares about about and reliving the last moments of James Huston's life. And for the record, he called himself the third James because James Huston was James Huston Jr. While being a good textbook example of this phenomenon, I'm sorry, give me a second. While being a good textbook example of this phenomenon, it isn't the only documented case, as I said previously, nor is it the only case where the past life was positively identified. This particular group of researchers specializing in identifying, if possible, the past lives which children between the ages of 2 and 5 were reporting with the goal of working through it as a therapy to help the children move past the previous life and get on with this life in a healthy way, with a high degree of success, I might add. What this case does also illustrate, though, is a phenomenon another psychologist has termed past life traumatic stress disorder, or PLTSD. Someone with this disorder presents with emotional trauma, irrational fears, sometimes nightmares, and many of the symptoms of PTSD without any explanation in the context of their life experiences, and sometimes involving factual details inexplicable to this life as well. From childhood, a person might be terrified of drowning in water without any obvious event in their lives to explain it. A person might have horrifying nightmares of images that they could never have possibly seen either in images or their life experience. A man might become emotionally upset to tears at the thought of not being able to bear and carry children, even though it makes no sense for him to be upset by this. One researcher speculated that the psychology of transgenderism might be because that particular soul or consciousness was in fact the opposite gender in the previous life, and was confused and unable to let go of it in this life. The brain is a fascinating instrument and will try to conform itself to whatever the consciousness believes that it should be. One psychology author wrote along these lines that memory is emotional in nature. That is, our strongest memories are tied to the strong emotions we were having at the time. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the memory. A person might clearly remember the person and events surrounding a strong, passionate romance. They might remember clearly what it felt like to rescue somebody as they went into crisis response. The warm feelings and affection of a mother's or father's love are strongly remembered. At the same time, emotionally traumatic events also imprint themselves strongly, such as watching a friend die, being beaten or abused, or nearly dying are things which people only forget because the emotions surrounding them are so strong they overwhelm the mind's ability to cope with them. All of these things appear to be the kinds of emotional memories which can be carried over from one life to the next. That is, it appears that, rather than factual or logical data, it is feelings and emotions and the memories, even images associated with those, that imprint themselves on a person's soul or consciousness. And these emotional imprints are what can present themselves without any plausible or even possible context in the experience of one's current life. Of course, all of this requires that one accepts the possibility of reincarnation, something which flies in the face of Western ideology, either atheist materialism or traditional Christianity. It's easier to believe that someone is just crazy than to change one's ideological worldview to accommodate evidence which doesn't fit it. The problem, though, is that telling someone they're just crazy rather than accepting the possibility that your worldview may be incomplete is itself harmful to the person, and it is itself bad science. The most accurate view of the world is one which is able to incorporate and explain all available evidence and data, not just that which one agrees with. Now, personally, I've made little secret about my more recently found belief in the passing of one's consciousness from one life to the next over the last couple of years, or my belief in a final resurrection as the New Testament also teaches. I see no contradiction between the two. There are parts in the Gospels, as I mentioned towards the beginning of this video, where Jesus and his disciples assume this possibility. And the idea of a kind of reincarnation in the Western world dates back to Pythagoras, though is really expounded on by Plato. The possibility was just as much a part of the Hellenistic understanding of death in the 1st century as was Hades, Elysium, and Tartarus. This understanding of the possibility had passed into Jewish religious thought by the 1st century. And to this day, the ultra-Orthodox Jews still consider it to be a valid part of their theology. From those studies done of kids who remember their past lives up to about 5 or 6 years old, to the many testimonies of near-death experiencers, and of course the testimony of the Holy Scriptures, it's clear to me that one's soul or consciousness is not tied to the body and does not cease to exist when the body shuts down and dies. This is what the evidence which I've studied and read has led me to. And again, what is often quoted here in rebuttal is the verse in Hebrews. After all of my study and ruminations on the subject, I've come to understand that there is more than one way to understand this verse. The question which must be asked is, what comprises a human being, or anthropos in the original Greek? Is it the consciousness of the person alone, or is it the consciousness and the body? Is each separate human life which the consciousness inhabits an individual human being with their own experiences, thoughts, memories, and so on? If so, then this concept that an individual human being can only die once can and does coexist with the consciousness living multiple lifetimes, inhabiting different bodies and assuming different personas. It's like a person creating an avatar in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. They play that character up until the character dies, and then a new one is created. Each time, as it's been observed, there's an amnesia which takes place, so that the new person is unaware and unconscious, most of the time, with the exception of those aforementioned kids, of any of the previous player characters before them. One character might be a rogue and a scoundrel, another might be a saint or a paladin. One might be a man, another might be a woman, as the consciousness, the player itself, knows no physical gender. There will always be some hints, some unconscious tells, some choices which the player simply will or will not make, regardless of which character they're playing. But otherwise, each character is a separate individual. Personally, this understanding honestly brings both comfort and a sense of tragedy to me. On the one hand, no one is ever truly lost, as the soul or consciousness itself is immortal and eternal in nature. On the other hand, each combination of consciousness and body into a unique human being is in itself special and worth knowing, with their own stories, their own memories, and their own triumphs and tragedies. These individual characters live on only in our memories, while the consciousness behind them moves on to a new avatar and a new experience.